Hi, I'm Conrad Fischer. I'm the Director of Educational Development at Nassau University Medical Center, and here is our next section of physiology. A very basic of the basic sciences, fluid distribution and edema. How do we understand the different fluid compartments within the body? Now, the first thing is we have 2/3 of the body being intracellular. The water, 2/3 of the water is intracellular. I know it's hard to believe that you would think that most of it is inside your blood volume, but it's not. So the thing is, though, is vascular volume, the whole vascular volume is only about 5 liters overall in vascular volume. And if you think about that vascular volume, only 3 liters of it is plasma. And that's because 40% of it is going to be red blood cells. Now, if we look at total body water, the total amount of body water in your entire body is about 60% of your weight for a man, about 50% of your weight for a woman, because women have more adipose tissue, which is to say about 5% per breast. Now, that means me, the fish, right in front of you, I am 100 kilograms. I have 60 liters of water in me. I can't even believe it myself. I got 60 liters of water. My God, I'm like a swimming pool. I'm like an ocean. Dive in. Here we go. 60 liters of water in me? Yeah, 60 liters of water in me. But of that 60 liters of water in me, I'm the perfect one for this, being exactly 220 pounds, being exactly 100 kilograms. As a 100-kilogram Dr. Fischer, that means 60 liters of water in me, and of that 60 liters of water in me, 40 of those liters will be intracellular fluid, and 20 of those liters will be extracellular fluid. And of the extracellular fluid, most of it's not in the plasma. 2/3 to 3/4 of that extracellular fluid is interstitial, in between the cells. It's very interesting, isn't it, that in between your cells, there's more than is actually in circulation? Well, look at it like cars parked on Broadway outside here. There are more cars that right now that are parked on the street than there are actually in circulation. So if you think about it, well, overall, more cars are parked than are actually floating around in the street. And so it is with the vascular volume. Now, this fundamental concept of looking at osmolar draw. There's the pressure of concentration of something which moves solutes in water. And there's electrical pressures, electrical forces pushing it. Now, there's concentration forces, a pressure. There's concentration forces, a pressure. And at the same time, there's also electrical forces for things that have charges, like electrolytes. So we look at this slide here, and we see the balance between what's in the cells and what's outside the cells, interstitial and intracellular fluid, extracellular fluid. In which way is the fluid going to go in this slide? Will it go from A to B or from B towards A? And the answer is that the fluid will go from A towards B. The fluid will go from A towards B because there's a greater concentration. Because there is a greater concentration. We have a concentration of 6 here, and we have a concentration of 12 over here. So that means that the fluid is going to go from the left-hand side to the right-hand side of your screen. Now, the way we call it osmotic pressure is, let's say that you actually put something here on top of this panel. That would mean that the fluid draw would actually push up this panel. It would actually make this side of the compartment, the B side of the compartment, would become larger. That means you can actually use that osmotic gradient of pressure, literally could lift up a board. If there was a board that was mobile there, could lift it up. And that's what we mean by osmotic pressure. Not oncotic, which is plasma protein, but osmolar or osmolar pressure. In other words, if you had a weight on top here, on top of this, if there was a panel, that pressure of water moving from the left side of your screen to the right side of your screen, that pressure could actually lift up a weight as the water. Now you might say, well, how much weight? Well, it depends on what the concentration gradient is. And that concentration gradient will pull water across and lift up that side and make the compartment on B will become larger. There's a basic physiologic principle, but you can't do anything in the nephrology section, certainly without understanding that one. Half of nephrology is understanding hydrostatic pressure, which is just simply water pressure, like a garden hose, like a fire hose. Osmotic pressure, which is like sucking on sour candy. And electrical pressure. Because if this was in electrical pressure, let's say that you had charged substances in here, and you had potassium, which is a cation there, and you had a sodium, which was a cation on the other side. Well, these two forces, which are both cations, these two cations would actually repel each other. So in body compartments, we'll be looking at the difference between osmotic pressure, which is concentrations, providing a draw of water to the area of higher concentration, balancing out with electrical forces, and in the nephrology section, it looks at hydrostatic pressure, which is created by arteriolar dilation and constriction. And between those three things, we have the way fluids move around the body. Now, intracellular fluid, moving things around between the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid. You'll see, now taking things out, now basically osmolality. Osmolality is equal fundamentally to something around 2 times the sodium. Now that is because a sodium is bound up with a chloride, and if it's not a chloride, there's also other anions within the body. Now most of the time we're not measuring those anions routinely, but in a normal person, serum osmolality is basically equal to 2 times the sodium plus 10. Now, under conditions of pathologic increase, we can actually incorporate the BUN and the glucose, the blood urea nitrogen and the glucose. Now, in a normal person whose blood urea nitrogen, BUN and glucose are normal, that is a very small component because on around 300 milliosmoles, of concentration, the BUN and the glucose provide a very tiny amount, about 10. But what if you had conditions of pathologic increase, like people with DKA or non-ketotic hyperosmolar syndrome, and then you had a glucose of 1,000 or a BUN of 100, huge increases? That's when we have to compensate for it with saying BUN over 2.8 and the glucose over 18. Now, you ready? You don't need to know the whole formula to pass step 1. But you know, our object is not just to pass here. Our object is to kick ass. My new motto. We're not here to pass, we're here to kick ass. And what that means is these courses long ago ceased to be merely remedial courses. These courses are excellence courses. They're made to take the person who would have a 225 by themselves and get a 245. The person who would have a 238 and make it a 270. And I'm very happy to say that for 6 of the last 14 years, the highest scores in the world have passed through these courses. Because we're here to excel. And that means if you really want to excel, you'll add in the correction for BUN and for glucose, which you don't need to pass. And I know it's painful because it has numbers, but at least it's straight addition. Osmolar pressure is largely the sodium. To compensate also for the chloride, you basically multiply the sodium times 2. But every time you see a low sodium or high sodium, you should be thinking the person is hyperosmolar or hypoosmolar. Too concentrated, too dilute. Now, when the ECF, extracellular fluid osmolality, increases, the cells will shrink because it will suck liquid right out of the cells. When the osmolality decreases, the cells will swell up. Okay, I got it, I've got it. It's called making human teriyaki. Teriyaki human. You marinate the human being in a hyperosmolar solution and the cells will become dehydrated. This is the very concept of pickling somebody. Why is it that pickling works? 1,000 years ago in the Middle Ages, when there was no refrigeration, we could store things pickled for a long time. Because we knew even then that if you put something in a solution that had high sugar and high salt, it would dehydrate the fruit and a big cucumber becomes a little pickle. Well, why could it be preserved without refrigeration? Because when you have an increased osmolality and the cells shrink, what's happening to the sodium concentration within the cell? It's increasing. When the ECF, extracellular fluid osmolality, goes up, it takes fluid out of the cells become dry, hyperosmolar. And when you raise the sodium concentration inside the cell and inside the substance to a sufficient amount, bacteria can't grow. That was the fundamental basis of pickling, a permanent preservative. Why? Because you dehydrate the stuff and you raise the salt content to basically where the bacteria can't live. So, generally speaking, the intracellular and extracellular concentrations come into balance because over time the osmolar pressures will become equal to each other. And that's why it is that we don't seize or have mental status changes, because they come into equilibrium. Just remember, every time you raise this osmolality of the blood, cells become dehydrated, and every time you drop the osmolality, the cells will swell. What happens when I put a drop of blood into a glass of water? What happens when I put a drop of blood into a glass of water? The cells will swell because the water should have no sodium and the cells should have 300 milliosmoles. The cells will swell to the point where they burst. That's why if you want to kill somebody, put a liter of water inside them. Just put in straight on ahead water and the cells will swell. That's why in the hospital we never use just water. D5W, D5, dextrose 5%. That's how come the cells don't swell and burst. Now, units of concentration, pain in the buttocks. Basically milliosmoles per liter, it's what we just said, the concentration, osmolar particles. You could also refer to it as millimoles, although we don't like millimoles because most things don't use the term millimoles. We like to talk in terms of concentration, in terms of osmoles. Isotonic, iso means the same, tonicity. In other words, normal tonicity is about 300 milliosmoles. Now, 300 milliosmoles, you'll see it's rounded, 285, 290. We round it to 300 to make life easy for people who go to medical school who are typically terrible at mathematics. So we round it to 300. Now, you might say, well, it's pretty much the same, but you know what? The hypothalamus is able to sense as little as a 1% change. The hypothalamus, which have the osmoreceptors in the body, can sense a 1% change in osmolality and change antidiuretic hormone around a 1% change. So, in fact, even rounding 285 to 300 does actually result in would be a significant thing. Okay, and if you went to 305 and 310, in fact, that person is hyperosmolar, and that would increase a lot of ADH, even 5 or 10 points above normal. So we're rounding to 300 to make our life easy. Now, these diagrams of looking at the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid. Remember that 2/3 is generally intracellular, 1/3 is extracellular. Of the total body water is 60% of your weight if you're a man, 50% of your weight if you're a woman, and that's because women have more adipose tissue and adipose is without water, so men are more watery than women. Yes, men are more watery than women. Okay, so if we're looking at the amount of water we have, most of it is in the cells, and of the extracellular component, most of the extracellular component is interstitial. It's not plasma. Only a small amount is plasma or blood volume. And again, plasma is the amount of the blood taking away the cells equals plasma. Blood without cells is plasma. It's the broth in the soup. Now, did you ever wonder, by the way, what's the difference between plasma and serum? Serum had its clotting factors removed. So plasma is the part of the blood that's liquid that still has clotting factors. When we use the word serum, we mean something that's in post-clotted blood. Post-clotted blood, what's left is serum. So basically, serum and plasma are almost interchangeable, and in terms of body volumes, plasma and serum are interchangeable. But plasma has clotting factors in it. Now, in general, we're going to use the term plasma here because we're talking about it in real-life situations, what's actually inside your body, and what's happening inside your body has the clotting factors in it, so plasma is physiologic. Serum is not physiologic because if you had serum, you'd be dead. Test tubes in a lab have serum. You got plasma. You've got plasma. Now, what happens here in terms of the solute concentration, volume and solute concentration? We're looking at the total amount of volume in each component. This slide is not showing a particular alteration, it's just an example. Just an example. Here, when you have it moving down here, this line from the normal up here, and it's moving down, that's what it would look like if the serum osmolality went down. Let's say if this is normal and we have an osmolality of 300, and let's say that it moved down, went to 250. This is showing the concentration in the body going down, and it shows it's gone down in both components, the intracellular and the extracellular fluid. Now, in this example here, it's showing a decrease in the volume inside your extracellular fluid. This moving down is saying that the volume of the extracellular fluid is going down. So this person would have a decreased amount of a hypotonic plasma, a decreased amount of hypotonic. Okay, just an example. And this is showing expansion of the intracellular volume. Now, these charts are basically to show, these graphs, to show the relationship between volume and concentration. Volumes are this way, concentrations in this way. If the line moves down, you're hypoosmolar. If the line moves up, you're hyperosmolar, the serum osmolality or the intracellular fluid volume osmolality going up. If it's moving this way and this way laterally, that's a change in the volumes. Let's look at this example here. Loss of isotonic fluid. Now the loss of isotonic fluid, remember, if we cut your head off and you bleed out 2 liters in 10 seconds, you are losing a lot of volume, but you're losing only plasma volume, only blood volume. So that's why you're losing the volume that is only in the extracellular fluid, and in fact, only the volume that is the plasma. Now, the reason why there's no change in the intracellular fluid is because if the osmoles in the intracellular fluid and the osmoles in the extracellular fluid are the same at 300, even though I lost this volume, the 2 components have the same concentration. And since they have the same concentration, there is no movement of fluid in either direction. Loss or gaining of isotonic, iso, same, tonicity, concentration. Loss or gain of isotonic fluids changes only the extracellular fluid volume because there's no osmotic draw in either direction. Hemorrhage is an excellent example of this because hemorrhage you're losing only blood volume but not changing concentration. Next one. If you lose a fluid that has a different tonicity, hypotonic, now it changes both because if you're losing hypotonic solutions, what ends up happening? If you are making a urine that has hypotonic, and remember the maximum diluting capacity of the kidney goes down to the 50 or 100 milliosmoles, the distal tubule, top of the distal tubule. Well, if you've lost hypotonic fluid, you have retained the osmolar particles. I lost water, but I retained osmoles. I lost water, I retained the salt. I lost the water, I retained the salt. And retaining the salt is why the osmolality is going up. I lost water, but I'm retaining the salt. So the concentration in the body goes up. The concentration in the body goes up. Now, initially, that volume will be lost first. The volume will be lost here in the extracellular fluid compartment. Now, what will happen is that first, the osmolality will go from normal. Let's say it goes up in the extracellular fluid component. it'll go up first in the extracellular. The osmolality goes up first here. If the osmolality in the extracellular fluid component goes up, what is the effect on intracellular? Which way will the fluid move? Will it move into the cells, or will the fluid move out of the cells? Will it move into cells or out of cells? If your blood becomes more concentrated, fluid will move out of the cells. So fluid will move out of the cells to compensate for that. And by the way, that's not far different than our very, very first picture. And in our very first picture here, as we go back here, you'll see, is that if the extracellular fluid component becomes more concentrated, fluid will move out of the cells as a part of the osmotic draw and will dehydrate and shrink the cells. And that's what's happening here, is that the fluid will move out of the cells. That's why this volume, that's why this is showing the volume is decreasing. That's why this is showing that the intracellular fluid volume is decreasing, because the fluid is going to move to compensate. If I lose a liter of fluid out of the extracellular fluid volume, if I lose a liter out of here of mostly dilute water, the concentration will go up. And what will happen is that the intracellular fluid will lose volume to try and make it in balance. So under equilibrium, you will get an even amount of osmolality between both components, and the cells will shrink. Now, you see the example here, sweating? Sweating, you lose a little salt and a lot of water. So you lose a little salt and a lot of water. So what will happen is your extracellular fluid component will become concentrated. That will dehydrate the cells. The osmolality will eventually come into balance, and you'll have two components that contract. Smaller volumes, high concentration in both of them. That's what happens with sweating. You use a diuretic, hypotonic urine, diabetes insipidus, loss of antidiuretic hormone. Loss of antidiuretic hormone will result in this same thing called loss of hypotonic urine. The word diabetes itself means a fountain. A fountain. And it's because you're peeing. Mellitus means sweet because it's got a lot of sugar in it. Insipid, for us, it comes to mean a bland personality, but it generally means tasteless. Tasteless. Watery. Insipid. An insipid personality. A bland person. Insipid urine means tasteless urine as opposed to sweet. Next one. What happens if we take salt tablets? Well, if we take salt tablets, then remember that osmolality is basically equal to 2 times the sodium plus 10. 2 times the sodium chloride tablets. Well, what will happen is that the concentration, the osmolality in the blood will go up. And now we're going to start to pickle your body. We pickle your body because it's going to basically dehydrate the cells. We pickle your body, you take in salt tablets, the osmolality in the extracellular fluid will go up, and this will suck water out of the cells. Salt tablets, pizza, potato chips, will take all the salt and put it in the blood volume, and it'll dehydrate the cells, just like pickling someone. So initially, the ECF concentration will go up, but this is showing what happens over time. They must equilibrate. So if you're saying, wait a second, why is the intracellular fluid osmolality going up? Because these graphs, these charts, these pictures are showing what happens when it's equilibrated. When it's equilibrated, the high salt in your plasma is going to take the water out of your cells, the osmolar concentration will become equal, and you will basically dehydrate the cells, just like pickling. The big cucumber goes into the salt sugar solution. It will take water out of the cucumber, leaving a smaller cucumber, and that's why when you're doing pickling, I make it sound like I'm Susie Homemaker here out there. I make it sound like I'm a guy out there on a farm doing pickling. Listen, I've seen a picture of a pickle in a supermarket once. I live in New York City, okay? But the whole point is that if you were doing pickling, you can't fill up the jar all the way, because what happens is that the cucumber becomes dehydrated. The cucumber becomes dehydrated, and water will come out of the cucumber and into the jar. Next, tap water, distilled water. And by the way, the bacteria counts in tap water in general are better than even in bottled water. So tap water is just as good. Okay. So when you have tap water, distilled water, which has very low sodium content, /0 sodium content, the lowest sodium content is in distilled water. What ends up happening is that the volume of the extracellular fluid will go up. The osmolality of the extracellular fluid will go down. And what will happen when the osmolality goes down is that it'll equilibrate. It will equilibrate. And what will happen is that volume will move into the intracellular fluid. It will equilibrate. The same way that if you were putting somebody, a dead body in water, a dead body in water swells and bloats up. All people who die of drowning end up being all bloated up and watery. Now again, these graphic representations show these volumes when they've achieved steady state, when they have equilibrated. Initially, if you put a liter of water into the body, it will be the extracellular fluid osmolality that goes down and the extracellular fluid volume that goes up. And then over time, the intracellular fluid volume, the cells will swell and become less concentrated. Over time, this shows an equilibration. This shows the formation of edema. Now, if you infuse hypotonic saline, what the hell's the difference? Food, yeah, nah, it's the same thing. IV fluids, that's hypotonic, or a big glass of water, food, yeah, nah. The same thing, yeah. It's the same thing. Now, that is why when a patient comes in with hypotension, with sepsis, burns, GI bleeding, sepsis, burns, GI bleeding, volume loss, and is hypotensive, we want which one? Plasma volume, or we want intracellular fluid volume? A person comes into the emergency room, they're hypotensive, tachycardic, confused from decreased cerebral perfusion. They are bleeding, they had a motor vehicle accident, they had trauma, they have sepsis, they had burns, they cut themselves. Where do you want the volume? In the vascular space or in the intracellular space? You want it in the vascular space. What fluid is appropriate? Normal saline. You want normal saline. Because if you use hypotonic solutions like half normal saline, the volume will tend to move into the cells more. And we don't want the volume to move into the cells when someone's hypotensive. We want the volume to be in the vascular space. Because whether or not my triceps as a muscle are filled with volume when I'm hypotensive is not as important as my brain being perfused and my coronaries being perfused. So that's why in any major volume loss, you want to use normal saline or Ringer's lactate, which are isotonic solutions. If you use an isotonic solution, you will expand the extracellular fluid volume because there'll be no osmotic draw into the tissues. If I give you saline, which has 300 milliosmoles, 308 to be precise, if I use saline, which has 300 milliosmoles, and your intracellular fluid has 300 milliosmoles, the fluid will stay in the vascular space. It won't go into the tissues. If you use D5W, half normal saline, 0.3 saline, any of the other things that are less than 0.9%, the fluid will go into the cells. And that doesn't help perfuse organs that I like my kidney. Now, this next slide shows what's the effect on infusing isotonic saline. In isotonic saline, which is to say 300 milliosmoles, we have normally a concentration of 300 milliosmoles here and 300 milliosmoles here. If we infuse isotonic saline, where will the fluid go into first? It will go into the extracellular fluid volume. To be very precise, it gives you plasma volume. Now, since isotonic fluid has the same osmolar concentration as the intracellular fluid, what is the net direction of the movement of fluid? Where will it move? The answer is no place. The fluid will not move because there's no osmotic draw. It will not go this way, it will not go that way, because there's no osmotic draw. That's why isotonic saline, also known as normal saline, also known as 0.9% saline, or Ringer's lactate, all mean the same thing. Isotonic saline, normal saline, 0.9%. Ringer's lactate is also an isotonic fluid, 300 milliosmoles. Don't get confused. They mean fundamentally the same thing. It means that when you want to expand the fluid volume in the blood space, give isotonic saline. Now, if you give hypertonic saline, I know you might be cute, right? You'd be like, man, I'm going to get a little extra pull there. I'm worried about extra blood volume loss. I'm going to get a little extra pull. You just told me that 2/3 of the volume in the body is intracellular fluid and only 1/3 is extracellular fluid. And of that 1/3 that's extracellular fluid, 2/3, 3/4 is interstitial. The truth is that if you really wanted to be cute and you wanted to get the maximum amount of volume in the plasma, you can insert hypertonic solutions. Now, the problem with doing that is that when you raise the osmolality and you go from 300 osmoles to 350 osmoles, if you gave hypertonic solutions, you can cause a little problem called seizures and death. But you'll die with excellent blood pressure. So you might say, well, how come we don't use hypertonic solutions, hypertonic fluids, when somebody has a hemorrhage? Because we don't want to screw around with osmolality. When you raise the osmolality too quickly, you cause seizures. When you give too much salt too quickly, sodium problems gives problems with the CNS. A high sodium gives a high problem with the CNS. And low sodium with problems with the CNS, but sodium, CNS, and seizures. So if you give hypertonic saline, yes, hypertonic saline can expand plasma volume. It's also dangerous. It's also dangerous. So that's why, as a matter of experimentation, what will be the effect of infusing hypertonic solutions? The plasma volume will go up, and there will be an osmotic draw, because if we infuse something at 350 and the intracellular fluid is 300, there will be an osmolar draw into the plasma volume, but in the short term, you can end up causing a seizure from it. Now, when you have adrenal insufficiency, it's not the cortisol that's the problem, it's the loss of aldosterone. And when you lose aldosterone, aldosterone normally makes you retain sodium and excrete hydrogen ions, retain sodium and excrete potassium. So when you lose aldosterone, that's the same thing as saying that you lose sodium. Adrenal insufficiency means the loss of aldosterone. And the loss of aldosterone means you lose sodium. That's why the osmolality goes down. The osmolality goes down because you lose sodium. Now, when you lose the sodium, you're going to also lose, when you lose sodium and chloride, you'll also lose the water that goes along with it, and that's why the volume goes down. That's why the volume will go down. So what happens is that it basically is a cause of hypoosmolality. It's you lose sodium and chloride, and that's why people who have adrenal insufficiency lose blood pressure. Because when you lose sodium and chloride, you lose water. And when you lose water and sodium and chloride, you lose pressure. Okay, now let's summarize the whole thing. In this table is going to put all these things together. Now, in actuality, this table says the same things that we said before. And when you are shown the question, you notice that, oh, coinky dinkly, look at this. Oh, A, B, C, D, E, F. And it could say, which of these is represented by loss of free water? Which of these is represented by, which of these represents the loss of isotonic? Which of these represents the loss of hypotonic? Which of these represents the gain of hypotonic, hypertonic, isotonic? And you have 5 choices. And so you're going to be asked to say which of these represents the gain or loss of each of those individual fluid. It summarizes it. I lose isotonic. If I lose isotonic, I'm losing extracellular fluid volume. And since it's isotonic, the overall osmolality stays the same. So the osmolality stays the same, and that's why this line stays up there the same. Because it's loss of isotonic fluid, there is no net loss either way in terms of between the intracellular and extracellular fluid volume components. Diarrhea at the beginning is isotonic. Eventually what will happen though with diarrhea is it will dehydrate you. Same with vomiting. But at the beginning, it's loss of isotonic solutions. Loss is hypotonic. Dehydration in this sense means specifically loss of free water, dehydration. If you want to say sweating to make you feel better, that we're talking precisely about loss of free water, dehydration in this sense means sweating. Diabetes insipidus is sweating from your kidneys. Alcoholism is really the same as a diabetes insipidus. Alcohol inhibits the effect of ADH at your kidney tubule. So alcohol is a nephrogenic diabetes insipidus. Alcohol causes a nephrogenic diabetes insipidus. So alcohol is the same as free water loss, because that's why you do not buy the beer, you only rent it. Because you're not only going to lose the volume of your alcohol, you're going to lose free water with it as well. Because you're going to inhibit antidiuretic hormone, and when you inhibit antidiuretic hormone, you're going to lose volumes everywhere, and because of the loss of free water, the concentration of the body will go up. Loss of free water from both components, and the concentration goes up. This is a hangover. And a hangover is caused by the fact that you are dehydrating your brain cells. Now, the same way that we said in the first one, loss of isotonic solution, you just lose extracellular fluid. Gain of isotonic solution means that you're going to just gain extracellular fluid. Since it's isotonic, there'll be no net movement in or out of cells. Since it's isotonic, the osmolality stays the same. When you gain hypotonic solutions, when you pour in water into the person, the osmolality goes down in the extracellular fluid, and that will act as an osmotic draw into the cells. If the cells have 300 milliosmoles and you infuse water and make the extracellular fluid 250, it will end up drawing volume into the cells. The reason why this last one, giving hypertonic fluids, takes fluid out of the cells is because when the extracellular fluid space raises the osmolality and goes up, it will act as an osmotic draw and dehydrate the cells. Hallelujah. we're sold.